In Lesson 4.10, we're going to talk about the flaws that limit monetary policy and why it may cause inflation and not be as effective in the long run. If you recall, at the end of learning about fiscal policy, there was a whole long list of shortcomings of fiscal policy, like crowding out, the net export effect, politics, the business cycle, timing, all sorts of things, right, that could actually limit the effectiveness of fiscal policy. Monetary policy has a few issues too, but not really exactly the same problems. So first of all, one of the general issues is this question of how much control does the Fed really have? The Fed used to actually have more control when there was less international flows of money. But the Fed doesn't have quite as much control over interest rates now as it used to because of the availability of loans coming in and foreign direct investment. So that's not a problem that we can necessarily graph, although you could look at it as a comparison between the money market, which the Fed controls the money supply, and the loanable funds market, where we have this upward sloping supply of loanable funds that the Fed only has, partial control over. So that's one problem. A second problem is velocity, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in an upcoming lesson. But velocity is the number of times a dollar, for example, changes hands during the year. So the velocity of money in the United States is about 7, which means any given dollar bill or $10 bill or $100 bill gets spent about 7 times. So if the Fed increases the money supply, hoping that will increase the GDP, it's possible that we might slow down the number of times we spend dollars. We might not necessarily want to be spending that much money. They're trying to increase the money supply. We're in a recession. We're like, don't necessarily need to. So if we slow our velocity down to, say, 5, then having more money won't necessarily result in more frequent spending. So velocity can be a problem. Cyclical asymmetry, and we'll talk about this one a little bit more in class. This is probably the biggest problem with monetary policy, and that's the idea that it works really well at fighting inflation. So if the problem is inflation, check, right? We can do that, because if we take people's money away, if we make it really hard for people to borrow money, they won't, right? If you just basically freeze up the money supply, you raise interest rates to 20, 30%, or, even just 15%, which is what happened in the late 70s, you will effectively fight inflation. You will bring down the price level. It's very effective. But when it comes to fighting a recession, not quite as effective. Because during a recession, what the Fed's policy does is it tries to make money available for borrowing at banks. But there's 2 problems with that. One is, during many recessions, banks don't particularly want to lend their money. And in the most recent recession, due to the housing crisis, banks had lost a lot, right? They'd made loans that were not good. They were not getting repaid. Well, they weren't exactly eager to make new loans. So banks, for one, might say, no thanks. Consumers, similarly, and businesses, right? Businesses, we've already talked about this. Businesses don't necessarily want to invest during a recession. So even though that money is available and cheap, businesses might say it's still not worth it to us. So this actually gets called pushing on thread. And you can imagine if you pull a thread, it will come towards you in a straight line. But if you push a thread, it just kind of bunches up in front of you, and you can't actually push it forward. And that's what they're kind of doing. They're pushing a thread. They're trying to get people to borrow and use money, and people are saying no. So relatively easy to take away people's money, bring down inflation. Relatively difficult to convince banks, businesses, and consumers that new loans are a good idea in a time of recession. A third problem is something called the liquidity trap. And that basically happens when, let's say this is the money market. So we have our nominal interest rates and our quantity of money here. If the money demand curve, right, money demand curve goes kind of like that, and it flattens out. So over here, if we are at a relatively low quantity of money, if we increase the money supply, we will cause the interest rate to fall as predicted, right? Interest rates fall. But If we're over here, if we already have a really large quantity of money and the money demand curve has flattened out, further increases in the money supply do nothing to the interest rate. So the liquidity trap happens when we're in the flat portion of the money demand curve, which would be the case if we already had a very large money supply relative to our economy. Another issue is the short inside lag, but the long outside lag, which means decision making at the Fed is quick. Right? The Fed can decide overnight, we're going to raise the discount rate, we're going to lower the discount rate. Okay, the Fed is speedy. So unlike Congress, we just have this small group of people meeting and making decisions about the economy. But there's a long outside lag, especially for easy money policies or ones fighting a recession. In other words, they might very quickly lower interest rates. It takes a long time for that to impact borrowing and lending behavior by basically businesses making investments or by consumers. So the impact might take a very long time to be felt. There's less of an outside lag for contractionary monetary policy. We again have pro-cyclical bank behavior. Pro-cyclical bank behavior means in recessions, banks tend to hold on to their money and not lend it. And during periods of expansion, during periods of inflation, banks tend to continue lending and thinking everything looks like a good idea. So they tend to encourage the extremes rather than temper them. And we do have some leakages. And the two main leakages, if you think about the fact that the Fed works through banks, it relies on banks to make new loans every time they have excess reserves, and it relies on individuals to basically put their money back in the bank as soon as they have it. So two leakages from that fractional reserve banking system or from the monetary multiplier are sometimes banks hold excess reserves. And sometimes people, sometimes consumers, it's not letting me write this. Sometimes consumers hold cash. Crowding out and net exports, however, are not drawbacks of monetary policy, which is interesting, an interesting feature compared to fiscal policy. So why is there no net export effect? Well, if you look at this table, it shows us that with an easy money policy, the problem is recession, the problem is slow growth. We use an easy money policy, unlike fiscal policies, which drive up interest rates. Expansionary monetary policies reduce interest rates. Right? So fiscal policies are driving up interest rates, causing net export effect, but easy money policies are driving down interest rates, and that drives down foreign demand for the US dollar. The dollar depreciates, and our net exports increase, and then we can go back and check, oh yeah, that's what we wanted, right? We wanted higher aggregate demand, so that's good. And same with tight money policies. If you are fighting inflation, that tight money policy causes higher interest rates, unlike the fiscal policy. It causes increased demand for the dollar, appreciation, and a decrease in net exports, which causes aggregate demand to go down, which is favorable. That is what we wanted. What about crowding out? Well, you can work your way through those flowcharts as well, but let's just do one of them together. Let's say that we are in a recession, and instead of using an expansionary fiscal policy, which would drive up interest rates and reduce investment spending, the easy money policy, which would be increase the money supply, will cause interest rates to fall, which will cause investment to rise, which causes aggregate demand to rise, and that is the impact that we wanted, right? So one of the things that you've already seen is that if we use fiscal and monetary policy together, then you can neutralize the interest rate impact of your expansionary fiscal policy. So can we keep using them together forever? I mean, can we just do this? Like, oh, we're in a recession, so we'll increase government spending and we'll increase the money supply. So you can see here, this looks like a great idea, right? We've got our economy, say, was in a recession, but we decide to use an expansionary fiscal policy. We drive up aggregate demand, and you think, well, that's going to cause a problem because we're going to see increased interest rates and decreased demand. But no, instead, we're going to neutralize the interest rate problem, and we're going to increase demand again. Well, not so fast, right? Because even though crowding out might have been neutralized, this issue, right, of rising wages due to rising prices, that issue is not going away, right? So we're still going to see the rising wages. We're still going to see the leftward shift, the classical economist leftward shift in short run aggregate supply. We're still going to end up with higher price levels. And remember the Fisher equation. Those higher price levels, that increased inflation rate is going to cause banks to start saying, it's time for us to also raise nominal interest rates, right? So even this policy, this combination of policies can backfire in the long run. Ultimately, in the long run, if you keep increasing the money supply, you're just going to cause inflation and asset bubbles. So the only path to real economic growth, the only way to keep your economy growing is by expanding supply. You can't do it with any combination of simple Keynesian monetary and fiscal policies.